Coming up. All right, it's time to put my reputation on the line. What's my prediction? Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's talk for a moment about what's at stake in this election. Now, I've been through a bunch of elections, and I'm sure many of you have as well, but I've never seen anything like this because I've never seen one of the major parties go as far off the rails as the Democrat Party is now. There is full-on insanity happening in this country, and contrary to what you're being told, it isn't coming from the right. It isn't coming from the Republican Party. It isn't coming from Trump supporters. It's coming from the left. And far from condemning it, the Democrat Party is encouraging much of it, aligning with much of it, and when it criticizes it, it refuses to do so by name. You know what I'm talking about, but let me give you just a few examples, starting with some which are not the ones which get the most publicity. Segregation is making a comeback, and it's being pushed by people on the left. For example, we're actually seeing proposals to have African-American only dormitories at colleges. Companies and colleges have been exposed engaging in diversity training where the classes are taught separately for whites and blacks. Not only is that nuts, but it's probably a violation of federal law. Insanity. The lunacy of forcing an end to the oil and gas industry is coming from the left, of the insane spending of the Green New Deal, of tearing down millions of buildings and rebuilding them to meet new energy efficiency mandates, of ending fracking, the economic engine which has helped make the United States energy independent for the first time in my lifetime. And fracking, by the way, has increased the availability of natural gas, which is cleaner than coal. Well, you might say, aren't solar and wind the power of the future? Well, whether they are or are not, you know how you know they aren't now? Because they need subsidies to exist. And they need subsidies to exist because they aren't sufficiently energy dense to compete with oil and gas. And that's especially true of wind power, where new windmill farms would cease to be built after the end of subsidies. The Department of Energy has already issued a voluminous report on that subject, and I covered it in prior episodes. You know where you won't see the coverage of that report and that problem with wind power? In the mainstream media, or on any Democrat debate, or in any Biden or Harris speech. Forcing an end to the oil and gas industry, ending fracking, is insane. Hatred of our country is being pushed, and it's being pushed from the left. Critical race theory advances the idea that the structures of our society are imbued with racism. It's not just a matter of individual racists, as virtually any Republican or conservative or, frankly, independent would tell you. They acknowledge racists still exist. Of course there's still racists out there. But our country has done a tremendous job of minimizing those numbers. Racism is by far the exception, not the rule. But advocates of critical race theory would say the opposite, that our institutions themselves are inherently racist. And most Americans have been going about their jobs and their lives for years completely unaware that critical race theory was being taught in our educational institutions and even in seminars to federal government employees. Well, President Trump has taken steps to ensure that that ends with regard to federal agencies and federal contractors, and that step was no doubt a positive one. With a second term, the rest of the country may realize the danger of critical race theory and take steps to ensure that it becomes viewed the way it should be viewed, as a dangerous fringe belief. Think I'm overstating the problems with critical race theory? Well, consider the direction in which we'll head if those beliefs take hold and people like AOC and her fellow members of the squad advance to leadership in the Democrat Party. How long do you think it'll take before someone starts advancing the argument that the private property rights so central to the economic advancement of America are themselves unacceptable because they are imbued with racism? Think I'm being extreme? I don't think so. Look out not just years, but decades. We're talking about the future of America, and we're talking about an election that may have a greater impact on that future than any in the last 50 years. Critical race theory is insane. What about the lunacy of allowing biological males who identify as females to compete in girls' and women's sports competitions that's being pushed from the left? And when those competitions are allowed, the athletic authorities virtue signal and pat themselves on the back for their wokeness. But what they're doing is bringing about the eventual end of girls' and women's sports. And as I've addressed before in prior episodes of this podcast, the sad irony is that the Democrat Party, which was so involved in ensuring the passage of Title IX, which guarantees the availability of girls' and women's sports in educational institutions so long as boys' and men's sports are available, is now neck-deep in efforts that will help ensure that slots on girls' and women's teams are taken over by biological boys and men. The inevitable result: biological boys and men who identify as females, including ones who were only mediocre competitors on the boys' and men's teams, will end up winning championships and taking athletic scholarships from girls and women because of their unfair advantage resulting from their natural testosterone, abundance of fast-twitch muscle fibers, larger lung capacity, larger muscle fibers, and narrower hips, which result in a more efficient transfer of thrust to the ground when running. And parents of athletic girls will watch as their daughters, who spent years training, are robbed of championships and scholarships that they so richly deserve and which Title IX was meant to ensure. Think I'm overstating the extent to which the Democrat Party is behind this insanity? Well, consider the fact that in the House of Representatives, every single Democrat member except one sponsored the bill that would have forced schools to allow biological males to compete against biological females in girls' and women's sports, and the lone Democrat holdout has since lost his seat. Supporting such measures which would destroy women's sports is insane. And that's not the only college-based insanity we'd be confronted with if, God forbid, Joe Biden were to win. I've talked before on this podcast about the infringement of the rights of college students accused of sexual assault. The pressure was placed on colleges by the Obama administration by the letter its Department of Education Office of Civil Rights issued warning them about investigations if they didn't take certain steps to more aggressively investigate and punish alleged sexual assaults, including stating that they should use the preponderance of evidence rather than clear and convincing evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt standard. That resulted in some of the most egregious infringements of the rights of the accused that I've ever seen. Two instances come to mind that are so absurd that they make it clear that colleges are either so blinded by political correctness or simply so incompetent that there's no way they should ever be conducting these investigations, and should instead leave it to local prosecutors and courts who presumably know what they're doing, or at least know a lot more than these college administrators. The first of the two examples involved a college appointing the person to represent the accuser against the accused in the administrative process regarding the complaint. Can you guess who they appointed to represent the accuser? I'm pretty sure you can't because it's so ridiculous. They appointed the spouse of the administrator acting as the judge in the proceeding. Now imagine you're the student accused of sexual assault. What are you going to think when you find out that the representative appointed to assist the person leveling the accusation against you is the spouse of the judge? Is there any way on earth you would think the proceeding is going to be fair? Can you imagine that happening in a criminal proceeding? It's like something out of a bad movie, like something you'd see in a film depicting a corrupt small-town judicial system in the South in the 1920s. The second instance was a college which used its investigator as the investigator, the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury. And in all those roles, the investigator concluded that when one partner in a committed long-term relationship kissed his partner while that person was sleeping, it was sexual assault. I'm not kidding. That actually happened, and that's insane. My earlier episodes regarding these ridiculous cases go into the full details. The Trump administration has issued final rules granting protections to students and faculty accused of sexual assault, and they should prevent the outrageous infringements of due process occurring at many colleges. But would a Biden administration leave the rules in place? I doubt it. The activists on the left have slammed the new rules, and I would expect them to pressure a Biden administration to rescind them. But the new rules are reasonable and fair, and they respect the due process rights of the accused. Don't expect that respect if Joe Biden wins. They'll be rescinded, and the campus insanity will return. Suppression of speech is being pushed, and it's being pushed from the left on college campuses against professors or members of student government who have the audacity to utter a thought which doesn't conform to left-wing norms, and against conservative speakers invited to address students, and by big tech companies like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook against conservative members and commentators and Trump administration officials like the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol Commissioner and even President Trump himself, and by left-wing interest groups who pressure advertisers to abandon conservative shows like Hannity and Tucker Carlson Tonight. Freedom of speech is our most important right. It is at the core of who we are as a country. Suppressing that right is insane. At the same time that freedom of speech is being attacked by the left, they are also pushing government-compelled speech. Look at the case of Christian baker Jack Phillips, who owns the Masterpiece Bake Shop in Lakewood, Colorado. He's been hounded for years by complainants trying to convince government to force him to produce cakes which celebrate gay weddings, which conflict with his religious beliefs. We're not talking about requiring him to sell cakes to gay people. He's been doing that for years. What he objects to is decorating cakes to celebrate gay weddings. He's been forced to do that at the local level and refused, and had to fight all the way to the Supreme Court, winning without the court reaching the substantive issue, but rather with the court concluding that the local regulatory body had showed impermissible bias against him. That leaves the underlying issue open, and he continues to be pursued by the left. They continue to try to get government to compel him to engage in speech which conflicts with his religious beliefs. So at the same time that the left is trying to force people to shut up in colleges and online when they want to say something with which the left disagrees, it's trying to force devout Christians to speak, provided the speech conforms with what the left does believe. Perhaps this issue of freedom of speech and freedom to be silent best illustrates the disturbing societal endpoint if the left gets its way. That endpoint, everything which isn't prohibited will be mandated. And that would be insane. But we're headed in that direction, and our chance to turn in a new direction is by re-electing Donald Trump and down-ballot Republicans as well. Most of what I've just talked about is cultural and about individual rights, and that's where you tend to see the most obvious insanity of the left, which has become so central to the Democratic Party. Notwithstanding the contentions of moderation because they're running a 77-year-old candidate suffering the effects of senility and reading platitudes off a teleprompter when he's not hiding in his basement. But there are other plans, other policies, other attitudes coming from the Democratic Party that might not qualify as insanity, but darn sure qualify as incredibly stupid given the success of the Trump presidency on the economy prior to the arrival of COVID. First and foremost, I'm talking about the announced intentions of the Democrat Party, the Joe Biden campaign, to push back President Trump's deregulation efforts. President Trump has been repealing 8 regulations for every one passed, and that has been one of the major reasons why the economy was growing so aggressively prior to COVID. And perhaps most importantly, it was growing for salaries and wages were growing for the working class more aggressively than for more well-off individuals. The net worth of the bottom 50% of households increased by 47% in the first 11 quarters of the Trump administration. During that same period, the top 1% of households increased their net worth by less than one-third that amount. That growth was exactly where Donald Trump said it would be, and a big part of making that happen was cutting regulations. Doing so had a particularly positive effect on manufacturing, and workers in manufacturing plants are not in the top 1% of households. They're in the bottom 50%. So you know what a Biden administration would do? It would start passing new regulations. It would start regulating energy production. It won't go for the full Green New Deal, but it would use it as a framework. The costs would be extreme, and the economic momentum from President Trump's deregulation efforts would be lost. Is that insane? No, it's just stupid, and one of many such moves I would expect from a Biden administration. And if, God forbid, Joe Biden wins, don't expect it to stop at the economy. Donald Trump's foreign policy has been a revelation. Democrats have spent the last 4 years wringing their hands about everything he's done, including his very public and aggressive pressure on NATO partners to increase their defense spending. Well, you know what? It worked. They have increased their defense spending. Is it enough? No. But I can guarantee you that if he gets a second term, President Trump won't back off on the pressure. Biden, on the other hand, maybe he'll send Hunter to negotiate. In the Middle East, look at what President Trump has achieved in the Middle East. Peace treaty after peace treaty, normalizing relationships between Israel and multiple Middle Eastern countries. How has he done it? He's done it by upping the pressure on Iran with sanctions, having General Soleimani taken out by a drone strike, and decoupling from the Palestinian issue the negotiations between Israel and the other countries. By doing so, he made it clear to those other Middle Eastern countries that the United States is their protection against Iran, and it sent a message to the Palestinians that he wasn't going to let them hold up peace negotiations. By doing that, not only was he able to ensure that relations could be normalized between Israel and those other countries, starting with the UAE and no doubt eventually ending with Saudi Arabia, but he delivered a message to the Palestinians that they had better adopt a more flexible stance, or they were going to be left without any leverage. What would a Biden administration do? I think we know. It would relax the pressure on Iran and once again set up resolution of the Palestinian question as a prerequisite for any Israeli peace agreements, thus ensuring there will be no more. Is that insane? No. But it's really stupid. But that's par for the course with Joe Biden. You may remember what Robert Gates, who served as Secretary of Defense under President Obama, had to say about Joe Biden. He said that Joe Biden has, quote, been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades, close quote. Wow. That's about as tough a slam as I've ever heard. But you know what? It's hard to argue with him. After all, somehow Joe Biden managed to oppose the Persian Gulf War, where we were trying to overturn Iraq's invasion and occupation of a major oil-producing country, Kuwait, but support the Iraq War with all of its questionable justifications. After all, Joe Biden is someone who actually told President Obama that he shouldn't approve the raid to take out Osama bin Laden. Got that? One of the signature achievements of Barack Obama's presidency would not have occurred if he had listened to Joe Biden. And this is the guy that the polls are telling us is poised to become the next president. Well, you know from my prior episodes that I don't believe the polls, and I've explained at length why. Now I've explained at length why the Democrat Party, as it's currently situated vis-a-vis the left, is both insane and incredibly stupid. But I don't think that has to be permanent. The way to prevent it from being permanent, the way to push the party to move away from the insanity, to move away from the incredible stupidity, is to defeat it soundly at the ballot box. To be blunt, if you haven't already voted, make sure you do so on Election Day, and make sure you vote for Donald Trump and Mike Pence and every other Republican on the ballot. Even if you're a Democrat, and even if you disagree with Donald Trump on a bunch of issues, and even if you think he's crude, rude, and unpresidential, the only way to rescue the country from the insanity of the left is to resoundingly defeat the Democrats at the ballot box, and in so doing, force the Democratic Party to realize it must move back towards the center, not just pretend to do so by trying to fool the electorate with a senile old candidate who stands for nothing and can be pushed by the left wherever they like. Next topic. Land of Enchantment. If you're like me, you spent a lot of time trying to map out what's going to happen in the election on Tuesday. Can Trump emerge victorious with the same states he won in 2016, or perhaps lose a couple and just barely squeak by at 270 or just over? And if you're feeling quite positive, can he add to his 2016 wins? And when you think about those states he could add, I'll bet you're thinking Minnesota first and then maybe New Hampshire. After all, in 2016, Minnesota was quite close, and New Hampshire was the closest of all. If you're thinking even more positively, you might start looking into the possibility of President Trump winning Nevada. I certainly have, but you probably haven't spent much time considering the possibility that he could win New Mexico, the land of enchantment. After all, it is considered very much a blue state. George W. Bush won there in 2004, but that's the only time a Republican presidential candidate has won there since Ronald Reagan in 1988. So I certainly consider it a long shot. But I was reminded of something recently. Gary Johnson, the Libertarian Party candidate who ran in 2016, received 9% of the vote. That's shocking, isn't it? But perhaps it isn't once you realize that Gary Johnson was formerly the governor of New Mexico. So we know that Hillary Clinton won New Mexico in 2016, but by how much? 8%. That's all. Of course, that's a pretty significant margin until you realize that the third-party candidate received 9%. I have to believe that a significant number of Republicans unsure about Trump voted for Gary Johnson, and if that's true, then New Mexico was a lot closer to going red for Trump in 2016 than we realize. And if that's true, it's probably a lot closer to going for Trump this time than the polls are telling us. So what happens if President Trump does win New Mexico? Well, it only has 5 electoral votes, so it's unlikely to be the difference maker. But if President Trump took Nevada as well, that would give him 6 more electoral votes, and in combination it would equal the 11 electoral votes of Arizona. With the win in New Mexico and Nevada, he could completely make up for a loss in Arizona. Having said that, I expect him to win Arizona, but there's another angle to it. With New Mexico and Nevada, President Trump could completely offset losing in Wisconsin or Minnesota and the 2nd Congressional District in Maine. That district provides 1 vote, and Wisconsin and Minnesota each have 10. The bottom line is that winning in New Mexico and Nevada would give President Trump a great deal more flexibility. It would give him additional paths to 270. Next topic. Election predictions. All right, it's time to put my reputation on the line. What's my prediction? I've been saying for quite some time that President Trump is going to be reelected. Am I positive about that? No. How could I be? Most of the polls are telling me I'm wrong. I've explained in prior episodes why I think they're wrong. Moreover, because of the incredible level of early voting this time around, the late surge that President Trump has made might not have as much impact as in a prior election because there are fewer people left to persuade. But in the end, I expect President Trump to win the electoral vote and be reelected. I also expect him to lose the popular vote, primarily because of popular vote shortfalls in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, and New York City. The most likely scenario is that he wins the states that he won in 2016, except perhaps 1 or 2. For example, he might drop Wisconsin. He might win only one of Michigan or Pennsylvania, but he also might win all three. I wish I could rule out Joe Biden winning, but I can't. I will say this. Virtually every commentator and analyst that you watch on cable news would disagree with me on this point. I'm not predicting a huge win for President Trump, but the odds of a huge win north of the 306 that he would get if he took all the states he won in 2016 are actually higher for President Trump than they are for Joe Biden. Why do I say that? A lot of reasons, and here they are. Pollsters who mistakenly believe Democrat turnout will mimic the Barack Obama years and weight their poll samples accordingly and incorrectly. An incredibly unexciting Democrat candidate. Republican enthusiasm at levels I haven't seen since the days of Ronald Reagan. The advent of caller ID and cell phones dramatically limiting the ability of pollsters to reach potential voters. A Republican candidate who's been so vilified by the media that many voters are afraid to acknowledge to pollsters that they support him. The prevalence among Trump supporters of a desire to lie to pollsters in what commentator and cartoonist Scott Adams has referred to as a political dad joke. The tremendous success of Republicans in registering new Republican voters, the aggressive outreach of President Trump to the African American community, and the mounting evidence that it has borne fruit. The surprising strength of President Trump with Hispanic voters, the threat of another COVID lockdown in the event of a Biden win potentially driving young voters to vote for Trump or at least not for Joe Biden. And finally, as I've talked about on multiple episodes, the fear of rioting and lawlessness and defund the police efforts coming from the Democratic Party and the left driving suburban voters, especially women, even ones who are sometimes repulsed by President Trump's demeanor and tweets, to hold their noses and vote, contrary to what we've been told by the analysts, in favor of President Trump. Because first and foremost, they want safety, safety, safety for themselves and their families. You might be wondering what I think will happen down ballot. I think Republicans are going to hold control of the Senate. So if, as I suspect, President Trump wins, we should continue to see a string of well-qualified originalist judges appointed to the federal bench. The House of Representatives? I don't expect Republicans to take control. It's a possibility, of course, but not likely. Well, those are my predictions, and the one thing that is not only likely, but guaranteed is that I'll be back next week with another episode of Political Spirits, and hopefully I'll be able to talk about having been right about President Trump winning and Republicans holding the Senate. We'll have to wait and see. Please be sure to join me for the next episode and tell your friends to do so as well. And like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.